Let me start by thanking the organizers of Uplands Probus for inviting me to join your first virtual meeting. Let us view it as an experiment subject to refinement in the future. I was approached some time ago about speaking on the subject of the future of the global north. We should ask ourselves whether this topic is salient today, a time when we are in the midst of a pandemic. I thought about it and concluded that the subject is indeed worthwhile for several reasons. Let me give you just two. First, it is always important to think about the future. After all, the future will become the present soon enough, and we clearly care about the present. Second, it is good to think about what happens in distant places. Just consider the origins of the current pandemic. The future of the global north clearly satisfied the two reasons. The image you see here is typical of how many of us view the north. It is correct. It is not photoshopped, but it is also quite limited. The images you see here are more representative. The one in the center suggests the long, dark days and nights in the north. The two on the right show the snow and the ice. The one on the left depicts a vessel anchored, possibly stuck in the ice. And the one in the center bottom shows the wonderful northern lights, in this case in Norway. However, these images are also quite literal. Let me therefore go further and show how many Canadians look at the north. They see the northern reaches of our provinces and the three territories. Of course, many people around the world think that all of Canada is in the far north. But there's a different way to look at the north, and that is by making the North Pole the center of our view. We can then define the global north as the region within or near the Arctic Circle, that is approximately north of latitude 66 degrees. However, this view of the north is largely geographical and physical. It doesn't tell us much about what occurs in the north, let alone what will occur and what causes changes. To do that, and especially to understand future changes, we can ask ourselves a very basic question. And that question is, what are the forces that shape the future of the global north? In this slide, I will show important forces that shape or impact on the north now and in the years to come. The first force is demand for resources. I will elaborate on it shortly, but before doing this, let me identify other forces. They are going in a clockwise direction: geoeconomics, geopolitics, transportation and communication, technological advances, climate change, people and demographics, and governance. The order in which I list the forces is not important, but understanding each force is important, and understanding their interaction is crucial. For example, demand for resources is intimately intertwined with geoeconomics, geopolitics, and governance. Let us look at demand for resources. We know that the world population is growing rapidly, having just passed 7 billion and heading towards 9 billion by mid-century, as shown in the chart on the left-hand side and by its yellow line. If we view population growth in conjunction with rising prosperity, then it is clear that there will be a strong demand for energy, materials, and food, to name just three. By materials, I mean materials for housing, clothing, transportation, and infrastructure. Where can such resources be found? clearly throughout the world, but the north is particularly important since it is least explored and understood. Here we have a map that shows some of the known and prospective resources in the north. Oil and gas have received particular attention, but the global north also has other resources, such as metals and hydropower. Many of us know about the extensive oil fields in northern Alaska, in Prudhoe Bay. This field came into production in 1977, produced oil prolifically in the early days, but is now running dry. The change is shown on the chart. Today, the Alaska pipeline is less than half full, and there is a major decline in the oil production from that region occurring as we speak, and the current low oil prices are of no help whatsoever. Arctic resources are difficult to find and to produce. Nobody knows that better than Shell, which explored in waters off the Alaska coast and spent several $billions, ultimately not to find sufficient oil in order to make production worthwhile. It abandoned the effort and has in fact disengaged from exploration for oil and gas in the Alaska region. A good example of a mineral resource in Canada's north is the Mary River project on Baffin Island in Nunavut. This is an extraordinarily large and rich deposit of iron oxide. It is so rich that the ore can be smelted directly into iron without prior concentration. However, the ore body is not close to tidewater, and ice is a problem for the ore-carrying ships. Originally, it was intended to build a railroad from the mine to tidewater, but that was abandoned in favor of cheaper truck hauling. In spite of the high concentration of the iron ore, this mine is a very costly operation, and it was scaled back from the original design. So far, I've mainly talked about declining, abandoned, and scaled back resource development in the north. A bright spot, especially from the perspective of employing local northerners, is the growth of the Arctic fishery and the processing of seafood. The fish, shrimp, and crab live in pristine waters. It is remarkable that this resource is not marketed by emphasizing its special origin and purity. The resource is essentially sold as commodity seafood without a premium price. Great care will have to be taken so that the Arctic waters are not overfished. Due to the low temperatures, the animals grow slowly. The establishment of fishing rights and quotas is therefore most important. Hydroelectricity is an interesting and important northern resource. It is produced by harnessing the power of large rivers with large elevation changes. Norway has several installations north of the Arctic Circle, as shown by the yellow dots. Canada presently has none within the Arctic Circle itself, but we have several large hydroelectric facilities near the Arctic Circle. The closest ones are in BC, Manitoba, Quebec, and Newfoundland. You might have heard about the current hydroelectric development on the Churchill River. It is called Muskrat Falls, and it is located within the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. This project demonstrates the challenges of developing hydropower in the north for consumers in the south. The climatic conditions, remoteness from markets, and inexperience with projects of this type create major challenges. These challenges manifest themselves in cost overruns, schedule delays, and in the case of Muscat Falls, large financial liabilities and acrimony. The LeBlanc report, shown on the right, provides major insights into the challenges faced by a project like Muscat Falls. I would now like to turn to the force of geoeconomics and exemplify it by first focusing on Russia and China. This map shows these two large neighboring countries. They have a common border, about 4,000 kilometers in length. Therefore, it is obvious that basic conditions exist for cross-border trade and collaboration. This slide shows China's oil production and consumption. There's a large deficit which China has to overcome by importing oil. Even in 2011, a large amount came from Russia, and this amount has since grown substantially. The same holds true for natural gas. Russia and China recently completed the Power of Siberia gas pipeline. It supplies natural gas from Russia to China. Numerous other similar developments are underway across the China-Russia border. Let me illustrate the bilateral trade flows between Russia and China, as well as the direction of these flows. Oil and gas flows from Russia to China. Forest products move from Russia to China. Minerals, a good example would be iron ore, moves from Russia to China. Manufactured goods, on the other hand, largely move from China to Russia. Agricultural products flow both ways. Wheat, for example, flows from Russia to China, whereas fruits and vegetables flow from China to Russia. And of course, investments flows primarily from China into Russia. If you think that these types of flows are similar to the flows between the United States and Canada, you're quite right. So let's make a comparison. This table shows country areas, population, and gross domestic product for China and Russia. The column on the right gives the ratios and is very important. The area ratio is about 0.6, the population ratio just under 10, and the GDP ratio is about 5. Compare this to the US and Canada ratios. The ratios are very similar. So based on our experience with the United States, what does this mean for the case of Russia and China? It means that we can expect similar relations to develop between China and Russia over the longer term, as we have seen the relations develop between Canada and the United States. It also means that we will not find it easy, as Canadians, in the long term, to compete with Russia in the China market. Russia can supply China with oil, gas, minerals, grains, fertilizers, hydropower more cheaply and probably more reliably than Canada. Canada's geoeconomic competitor in China is therefore not Russia. We need to remember that. Geopolitics is often linked to geoeconomics. So let us take a look at the Arctic from a military point of view. We tend to think of it as being largely demilitarized, and this is generally true, but it is not entirely so. Canada's military capabilities in the Arctic are very limited. In contrast, Russia has strengthened and modernized its northern military capabilities, mainly since the start of the century. It is a deliberate effort and policy by Russia under the leadership of President Putin to show strength in the Arctic. The role of China in the Arctic is small, but still noteworthy. China has sent some vessels into the Arctic Ocean, but it is mainly developing its Arctic capabilities by working in the Antarctic. This slide shows research stations in the Antarctic. The ones with red arrows point to stations in which China is closely collaborating with Russia. Therefore, China is developing research, logistical, and military capabilities in icebound seas and on land under Antarctic conditions. These capabilities can be applied as needed also in the Arctic. Apart from China wishing to become a global power and extending its reach into all regions of the world, are there other reasons for China to be interested in the Arctic? Indeed, there are, and they relate to shipping. Here is another polar view of the Northern Hemisphere, and it indicates three basic routes. The Northwest Passage, shown in green, it is along the US-Canada coastline. The yellow routes, called the Northern Sea routes, along the coast of Russia, and the Polar Passage, straight across the Arctic Ocean, almost directly above the North Pole. The first two routes contain little or no ice for part of the summer, and therefore make marine navigation feasible. Of course, global warming may reduce the ice even more and for longer periods. The reason why the marine routes in the Arctic Ocean are attractive relates to distance and time of travel. For example, under ice-free or low ice conditions, a voyage from Dalian in China to Rotterdam takes about 35 days. The southern route via the Suez Canal would take 48 days. That is about 40% more. For large ships that cannot pass through the Suez Canal, the Arctic route would be even more favorable. We can therefore expect to see more marine traffic in the Arctic in the years to come. If everything goes well, we can see cargo ships in the Arctic, typically assisted by icebreakers, just in case there is a sudden change in sea ice conditions. Russia actually requires all cargo vessels to be assisted by Russian icebreakers. This is a good safety precaution, but of course, it adds to the cost of the shipping. Prior to the current pandemic, we also saw growing interest in Arctic cruises. But as we know, all cruise ship activities have largely come to an end. How long that impasse will last, we do not know. But there are other issues, apart from ice and pandemics. The picture on the left shows a Canadian vessel having run aground near Canada's northern coast. The reasons were poor charts, low water depth, and shifting sandbanks. Better navigational aids and seabed information is needed. The image on the bottom right is of a barge that started its journey in British Columbia. The line between the barge and the tug broke in the Arctic Ocean during a severe storm, and the barge drifted aimlessly for weeks. Fortunately, no harm was done, and it was eventually retrieved. We can therefore summarize some of the important issues of marine traffic in the Arctic. They relate to safety, environmental protection in case there is a spill as a result of a collision or a grounding. It's important to get approvals. I mentioned Russia requiring icebreakers to accompany cargo vessels. There are costs, even though the sea route is shorter, but there are increased insurance costs, and of course the vessels have to be equipped for Arctic conditions. There's also a need for crew training, and the operating window in the Arctic Ocean is not 12 months of the year, but it's typically less than half of that. So all that special crew training technology is not being used for part of the year, and all this adds to the cost. So far, I've spoken about marine transportation in the Arctic, but surface and air travel are also important. In all Arctic countries, there are few roads and bridges, making transportation by car, truck, and rail difficult or non-existent. This has major implications for communities and industrial sites, such as mines, some distance from tidewater. Air traffic is possible, but expensive. In many cases, there are no good runways, airports, and air traffic control systems. In order to overcome these problems, a considerable amount of thought has been given to the use of airships. They go back to the 1700s, and the Hindenburg accident is well known to most of us. However, airships have become quite reliable, as we know from sporting events where Goodyear blimps are often seen. Airships are interesting from the perspective of Arctic transportation. They do not need complex runways, and they can have large cargo carrying capacities. The Russians have advanced airships under development, and the United States have also shown interest. However, airships have never had major military significance, and therefore they have not benefited from the large investments which they require to make them commercial. Let me now turn to climate change, one of the most important forces shaping the future of the global North. As I will point out shortly, climate change in the North will affect not only the North, but the rest of the world. The impact of climate change will be seen in various ways. It will be seen in receding sea ice, but also in changes in the land and infrastructure. Higher temperatures lead to softening of soil due to melting of permafrost, heaving of land, and therefore railroads and roads. Climate change also has an important impact on the fauna and flora of the North. Some species, such as polar bears, will struggle, whereas others will thrive. Examples are marine species, because the ocean has less ice coverage for shorter periods of time. Sunlight can therefore penetrate more deeply into the water column, thereby giving rise to conditions favorable to such organisms. The melting sea ice in the Arctic Ocean will not only raise its temperature, but it will likely also impact major Arctic currents, such as the Labrador Current. This can in turn affect the Gulf Stream and change the climate of Eastern North America and Europe. Ocean currents are complex and interrelated. A change in one affects many others, and often in unpredictable ways. Much important research and simulations remain to be done. Here in British Columbia, we have an organization called Ocean Networks Canada, which is outstanding in terms of its capabilities to simulate and to predict currents off the west coast of Canada and also in the Arctic Ocean. I will now turn to the penultimate force that impacts the global North. It is demographics. This slide shows Canada's population prior to 2019 and then projected to about 2070. Canada's population will grow from about 37 million today to 55 million by 2070. This projection is for the medium growth scenario and takes into account immigration at the rate of approximately 300,000 per year. If we look at the breakdown by age of the population, several important consequences become clear. Again, focusing on the medium growth scenario only, the 15 to 64 age cohort is growing. But, and this is very important, the 65 plus cohort grows much more rapidly than the 14 years and under cohort. Put differently, Canada is having a rapidly aging population. But what about the North? This slide shows the population numbers for Canada as a whole and for Canada's 3 territories. While the population in the territories is small relative to the rest of Canada, its population is growing more rapidly, between now and 2040 by about 24%, whereas Canada's population as a whole grows by about 20% over the same period. Not shown in these graphs and slides is the fact that Canada's northern population is younger and richer in Indigenous people than the rest of Canada. The same is generally true for other countries in the global north, including the Scandinavian countries and Russia. Specific attention needs to be given to Indigenous peoples in the north. This slide provides a basic comparison between Indigenous self-determination in Canada and Norway. In Canada, Indigenous self-determination is expected to occur by following a path of self-rule within and by the Indigenous peoples, whereas in Norway, the path is via shared rule. The form of rule that will ultimately emerge will have a strong impact on the number of Indigenous people, their prosperity, and their willingness to collaborate in economic, social, and cultural development. This takes me logically to governance of the North, which is the last force I wish to consider. Governance of the North poses challenging questions, not only with respect to governance of people on land, but also governance pertaining to the ocean environment. It has long been established that all countries have extended ownership of the sea 12 nautical miles from their shore. These are called territorial waters. There's also a well-recognized exclusive economic zone that extends 200 nautical miles from shore. Countries have the right to use the marine resources, including the seabed, in this zone. In the case of adjoining countries that are less than 12 nautical miles or 200 nautical miles apart, the zones are divided and shared equally. In the late 1980s, the United Nations introduced an additional zone called the Extended Continental Shelf. Where such a shelf exists and extends beyond the 200 nautical mile limit, a country may claim it. However, it has to prove and get agreement from the UN for such claims. If granted, the claiming country has the right to the minerals and other resources in that portion of the continental shelf. This map insert shows the claims by various countries in the Arctic Ocean region. The overlap and hence conflicting claims are numerous. They are shown by the shaded areas. Canada filed its claim in 2019, and it remains to be seen how the UN will settle the disputed areas. It should be noted that there are not only different views and claims on the extended continental shelf, but also disagreements on the Canada-US border in the Arctic. Specifically, Canada wants to see the Alaska-Yukon border extended into the Arctic Ocean. By contrast, the US wants a border extended perpendicular to the coastline. the heavily shaded area therefore results. To facilitate work on important matters in the Arctic Council was created in 1996 by means of the Ottawa Declaration. The Arctic Council is intended as a forum of promoting cooperation, coordination, and interaction. It doesn't have authority to resolve disputes, nor does it have authority to deal with security matters. The members of the Council are 8 countries. Canada is one of them. Indigenous people are represented as permanent participants, and then there are 13 observers. Observers attend and contribute, especially to the Arctic Council's working groups. You might ask, why are countries like China, Singapore, and Switzerland observers? The reasons are largely commercial. China has transportation interests in the Arctic. Singapore's position as a shipping center is impacted by more shipping via the Arctic Ocean, as I already stated before. And Switzerland has major interest in shipping insurance. The current working groups are shown on the following slide. Their work areas all lend themselves to cooperation, coordination, and interaction. However, there is no doubt about decision-making authority. It is by consensus, and by consensus of the members only. So let me finish by drawing 5 major conclusions. First, the North is a major source of natural resources. The Arctic Ocean also provides major transportation routes between Asia and Europe. And the North has a very important bearing on the climate throughout the world. Second, the future of the global North largely depends on what happens in the South. For example, does the South need the resources of the North? How will the greenhouse gas emissions in the South impact the climate and conditions in the North? Third, Russia-China cooperation will become a major factor in the North, but also in the entire world. We already view Russia and China individually as superpowers, but together they are an extreme superpower. They are that not only in the military sense, but also in the economic and political senses. Fourth, the claims regarding the extended continental shelf in the Arctic Ocean are unresolved issues. They could become the trigger of a major international impasse, but more likely they will exacerbate other international problems. They will not help to solve such problems. Fifth and last, Canada and BC are well positioned to support positive and sustainable development in the North, especially in the human, climate, and transportation sectors. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Please note the information on the next and final slide.